in the universe of AI going forward.
India is walking tall, India's stature is different, India's voice is being heard.
And the biggest newsmakers.
This is just a start. Tokyo, we won one bronze. Paris, we won a bronze.
Hello, welcome to the India Story, the only show from India designed for a global audience. I'm Vikram, Chandra, and on this show each week I decode for you the top stories from India that matter to you. And last week was indeed the week of the India Story. The Delhi G20 was a resounding success on the global stage. The summit and its declaration reflected India's foreign policy priorities and the nature of its relationships with key allies and with friends. And we spoke about that at length last week. This week, our focus is going to be on the other major key takeaway from the sidelines of that summit. An announcement that could be historic. The announcement of a India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Now, we explored this week the geopolitical dimensions of this strategic corridor that would link South Asia, well, India specifically, to Europe, through the Middle East, through Saudi Arabia. And we're going to be talking about it with former Ambassador Ajit Kumar and with Dr. WION, political analyst and distinguished advisor, West Asia. The IMEC will be a vital link connecting these regions and facilitating trade and investment. But, important to note, this is not a new route. We need to look at history to see how this was actually an ancient spice route, a part of the India story centuries ago, a trade route connecting Asia and Europe with the Indian Ocean and the Middle Mediterranean Sea. On today's show, we're going to be tracing that history with historian and member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Sanjeev Sanyal. He's also the person who wrote the book, The Ocean of Churn, about a lot of this. Also on the show, we explore how elections in the Maldives could impact India's strategic interests in this entire region. But first, a look at some of the headlines from India that you should be following. After days of speculation, the agenda of the Parliament special session was released by the government this week. A discussion on the parliamentary journey of 75 years, starting from the Constituent Assembly, will be held on the first day of the special session of Parliament. As per the official bulletin, this is what the agenda has right now. It's also listed tentative legislative business expected to be taken up, including the highly contentious and controversial Chief Election Commissioner Appointment Bill. The opposition, meanwhile, has criticized the agenda, calling it a disappointment and a diversion tactic. And the opposition has also expressed its apprehension that the government may have undisclosed plans that could suddenly come up. India's National Investigation Agency has identified 15 people who were allegedly involved in the attack by so-called Khalistanis on the Indian High Commission in London on the 19th of March. The agency now plans to send their details to the Immigration Department to issue a lookout circular against them. The NIA had issued photos of 45 people who were allegedly involved in the attack, and according to media reports, they identified 15 of them with the help of other agencies and also by crowdsourcing information. Tesla, the US-based electric vehicle manufacturer, plans to source components worth $1.9 billion from India this year. That's nearly double of the $1 billion last year. This was stated by the Commerce and Industries Minister, Piyush Goyal. Goyal also stated that going forward, demand for electric vehicles is expected to increase as the demand gap between electric vehicles and other vehicles is already narrowing quite significantly. The Indian Embassy in San Francisco has sought a thorough probe after a video of a police officer mocking the death of a 23-year-old Indian woman in Seattle came to the fore. Janvi Kandula was killed in January after she was struck by a police vehicle driven by Officer Kevin Dave. The video shows another officer who was called to the spot laughing at Kandula's death and saying that her life had limited value. The embassies called the incident deeply troubling, and indeed it is. In cricket, Sri Lanka edged Pakistan in a last ball thriller to reach the final of the Asia Cup. The holders will now be taking on record 7-time champion India in the summit clash. Moving to our special focus this week on the sidelines of the recently concluded G20 summit in New Delhi, an important decision was taken to establish the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. A MOU for this has been signed among the governments of India, the US, Saudi Arabia, EU, UAE, France, Germany and Italy. So clearly it's a big multilateral agreement involving many countries. So what is this trade corridor? Why is it so important? Why am I talking to you about it today? Essentially, this corridor is a proposed new trade route that would include establishing rail and sea connectivity between Europe and the Middle East, and then the Middle East and India, moving on to other parts of Asia. It would stretch across the Arabian Sea from India to the UAE, potentially cross Saudi Arabia, maybe Jordan and Israel. The exact routing is not particularly clear. And finally, it intends to connect all the way to Europe across the Mediterranean Sea. It aims to connect commercial hubs, lay undersea cables, expand energy grids, and also high-speed telecommunication lines. It aims to enhance internet access for communities, among several other things. Also, importantly, this corridor is clearly being viewed as a way to counter China's pet project, China's Belt and Road initiative that we have heard so much about, and that is potentially causing a lot of problems. Now this, of course, China's BRI is a huge infrastructure project, but it has raised concerns over that country's growing influence and, quite frankly, that country's predatory presence across 3 continents. The BRI has led to indebtedness in country after country, and they've been looking for solutions and answers and possible alternatives, and this new route could potentially provide that. Not just that, with the diversification of global supply chains, this new corridor could help reduce reliance on China, particularly benefiting Europe, which is of course heavily dependent on China for imports of goods such as electronics. The geopolitical alliance aside, this corridor will connect some of the world's largest economies while reducing transportation costs and time as well. It will also create new investment opportunities. However, let's face it, this corridor is an extremely ambitious and an extremely challenging project. The coordination, for example, between the countries to put up the required funds, the question of the execution of the project, who's going to be doing it, it's going to be a complicated process. And not just that, the political and security issues in some of the countries would also need to be resolved. Is Israel going to be part of this? Is Jordan going to be part of this? In fact, in what appears to be just the first of many likely obstacles in the path of this project, Turkey's president, for example, voicing his opposition as his country seems to have been bypassed. He said the most convenient line for traffic from the east to the west has to pass through Turkey, adding that there is no corridor without Turkey. Now, of course, you could contest that. There are lots of other ways to do it, including by sea, but at least that is what Turkey is saying. So yes, an ambitious project, but it is going to be challenging, and that's why it's really worth focusing a lot of attention on this. So let's try to understand where exactly this new opening to the Middle East is going to head to. Where is it going to lend itself and position itself on the atlas of the world? Great to have with us 2 real experts in the field, Ajit Kumar, former ambassador, and Dr. Wail Awad, senior advisor, West Asia of the Tilotoma Foundation. Dr. Jawan, let me start off with you. You're perhaps the best person to help us navigate through all of this. I've been talking to you about the geopolitics in India, in India, Middle East for a long time. How important a step do you think this is?
Oh, it's nice to see you again, Vikram. My greeting to you and to Ambassador Kumar. The question is important to see. India-Arab relations is not from this contemporary history, Vikram. Actually, it goes deep-rooted in the history. We have been connected with India for centuries. I mean, the ships used to come from the Mediterranean, coming to the Indian, to Kerala and Malabar, and exchanging the business with both the trades, and the traders stay for 6-7 months in India and go back. And that was the kind of bonds that have grown up over the years with India. Having said that, I would say that India and the Arab world relation have been very strong, even with the contemporary history. So there is no question to put this context of the new passage of new corridors in terms of the relations. It's just a culmination of the good relation that India have been building. You have more than 8 million Indians are living in the Gulf. You have more than 14 million Indians are annually in the Gulf countries. You have more than $70 billion revenue. So Indian food security, oil security, expat security goes all together in one hand with the Arab world. So India is a natural extension of the South Asia and to West Asia. So therefore, when India start having the surplus and the capital and thinking of access to the market, so India start thinking positively to be more proactive in the relation with the Arab world. And that's why we see the Prime Minister, ever since 2014, he has made a tremendous trips to the Arab countries, and every place he goes, there's a huge receptions for him. So this corridor actually is not new. The corridors have been always there. But what happened is that the war on Russia and Ukraine, the Silk Route of the Chinese, the American wanted to have an alternative route where you can have. Otherwise, North and South corridors have been there, whether it is with Russia, Iran, and India, whether it is through the sea. And India have always been all the ships going to the Gulf countries. So now the extension from Europe into, from the Mediterranean to Europe is also to accommodate Israel into the Arab fold. That's my final answer to you.
Right, I'm going to get into the history of it in a little more detail later in the program. The historical aspects of this are important, and I'm going to be speaking just a short while from now to Sanjeev Sanyal. But Ambassador Kumar, what are you picking up? Now look, G20 has obviously been hailed as a major success, but as a concrete development out of the discussions in Delhi during the G20, do you think from an Indian point of view, this particular development, this corridor, was maybe the most immediate and the most major item of significance to actually come out? A major strategic move?
Yes, I entirely agree. This is a tangible outcome which was agreed on the sidelines of the G20 successful summit. This is an important initiative which will benefit India greatly, because this initiative encompasses not only India, Middle East and Europe, but will also provide linkages in terms of trade connectivity, digital connectivity and infrastructure connectivity. And this corridor will help India economically integrate with this entire region with ship-cum-railways, multimodal transport, including road linkages. All this will help bring down logistics costs and speed up movement of goods and people, goods and people. Digital connectivity can be strengthened. Renewable energy will get a big push, both with the interconnected grids and pipelines. This means improved mobility and logistics at affordable or competitive costs. So trade and investment are bound to grow. So India to have a high seat at this global connectivity project is really important.
Right, Dr. Abad, what specifically are you being able to pick up on the nature of the corridor? Because it's not clear yet. Ships perhaps running from India to Oman maybe, or to the UAE, then railway connections, and then perhaps ships running across to Europe itself, either from other ports or ports in Israel, if that can be figured out, the politics of that. What are you picking up?
Well, Well, I think it's not just simply a rail track. It's also to transport new renewable energy, to transport oil and gas and hydrogen, clean hydrogen. So all these cables and also the networking of IT networking also to be taking place in this. So it's a major project which is going to be formalized in a manner that will benefit India for sure, and India will get the access to the European and a shorter term, because in terms of economy and trades, it is 35% as per the surveys that it will be reducing in the timing of reaching the goods to Europe. So if that is a beneficiary one, why not? This is a good development, because what we need, Vikram, at this stage is we need a stability in the Middle East. We need a prosperity. And if there is a stability, then such kind of a huge project can materialize. And I think that is why it is too early to judge whether it is feasible, whether it is viable, whether it is possible. I think these are the three issues has to be discussed with the expertise to find out how it can be implemented on the ground.
No, so why are you doubting the feasibility and the viability of this project? And are you doing that? Because it was sounding as if it was almost a done deal that we are going to go ahead and do this, irrespective.
It's not going to be a done deal. I tell you why. Because Israel, accommodating Israel into the West Asia with Saudi Arabia, with Emirates and Jordan, and avoiding Syria and Lebanon on this pipeline of the Silk Route, which comes with the Chinese BRI, it's exactly what's making us looking at the wider perspective of the actual things on the reality on the ground. So Israel could be, because of the I2U2 that India started with US and the Emirates, could be one of the reasons why they are increasing. But I'm saying it is not possible because we don't know. Sabotage can be anywhere. And it's a long-term process. It's not today going to happen. And $3 billion, a minimum cost of the project. So it's an overnight project.
Well, Ambassador Kumar, let me get you on the point that Dr. Awad was just making. The India to the Middle East part, I'm sure, is much easier to solve. There are lots of historical precedents for that also. Ships running from Mumbai or from Gujarat to Oman or to the UAE. It's that northern line that is a little bit more tricky. Would it go directly from the Middle East in some manner, via from Egypt? Would it go from the Haifa port in Israel, which has just been set up? How do you see that particular connection working itself out?
No, I think it can be done. It's not that this project has this economic corridor has just come up just like that. As far as I believe, there have been talks in I2U2. G7 project is there, which is backing this. And there are important countries like US and others who will back this. I think with today's technology, with all these logistical problems can be solved. After all, after some time, within 60 days, they are the experts and the officials and the team will meet and they will sort out all the details, how to go about it. So let's wait for that instead of casting doubts about it, about the feasibility of the product. I'm sure that this can be done.
All right, Dr. Awad, now, there's some aspects of this which are correct, would require other parties, such as the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That certainly has a lot of discussions that are still to take place. But the other side of it, when it comes to the ties, for example, between India and countries like Saudi Arabia, that seems to be continuing to move forward at a very fast rate. Just see, we can look at the state visit that has just taken place. So do you see a lot of enhanced and accelerated activity taking place on those aspects of it, which don't require any broader talks, which don't require getting in Israel, for example?
See, India, all the countries, the stakeholders have already agreed in principle what should be done for these lines and should be that economic routes or corridors. And Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, already have his own strategy of a new vision of Saudi Arabia. A new vision means 2030. He's quite ambitious. He's changing dramatically the infrastructure of Saudi Arabia. He's changing the concept, the thinking, the doctrine of Saudi Arabia from a hard Salafist Wahhabi doctrine into a sort of an opening society and accepting changes in Saudi Arabia. So if they succeed in doing so, then I think what the United States is trying also to tell to the world, Biden wanted to tell to his own voter next year that I am able to make a project which is beneficial for our allies in the region. So therefore, Saudi Arabia, for sure, will play a major role in doing so, in normalization of relations of Israel, but only with conditions. Saudi Arabia will not go for a full-fledged normalization of relation if they don't have the guarantee from the United States what sort of relation they wanted. And I think the cost of this relation will be the question of Palestinian issues, which everybody now trying to avoid, to talk only of economy, prosperity, that could be the source of stability. But the crux of the problem is a Palestinian homeland, whether they can get it or not. So until that sentiment, which is boiling in the Arab world, is not being satisfied with two-state solutions, I think that is where I'm saying Saudi Arabia will find it very difficult. As a leader of the custodian of the two holy mosques, will find it very difficult to normalize relation with Israel at this current situation and with the problem within the Middle East. So therefore, I talk not from a pessimistic point of view. I talk from an optimistic. I wanted our region to prosper and also our people to enjoy. But is it really feasible? Do we think the United States have changed its policy? They just invaded Iraq 20 years ago. They destroyed it. Massive deception, you know it. We talked about it hundreds of times. The same thing they did for Afghanistan. They are in Syria, Libya, Yemen. So are we serious about it? Or we just simply wanted to get vote on the bank vote we go to the ballot and decide the people that it's a successful foreign policy of the United States.
Right, and of course we have elections coming up next year. As we know, elections in India, elections in America. So I think that is a factor that we do need to keep in mind. One last word from you, Ambassador Kumar. The other strategic benefits from all of this entire Look West policy that is being pushed through and now taking a very concrete form out here. There are other strategic benefits beyond just the pure economics of it all. First of all, keeping China at bay. India doesn't want that Chinese BRI to become too dominant, so this is a very important route. And when it comes to Saudi Arabia and UAE for that matter, for India there are other benefits. Saudi Arabia has obviously been a very close strategic partner of Pakistan's in the past. So this opening up and this great close relations that are developing between India and Saudi Arabia has got other benefits as well.
It has other strategic benefits for India. You see, we have been trying to go through Pakistan for all this, the ancient Silk Route and all that. We want to trade with Pakistan and Central Asia. We have the problem of Pakistan out there, which does not allow it. So in this sense, this corridor, economic corridor, our ships from Mumbai will go directly to UAE in Dubai, and then it will enter Saudi Arabia. And so we are bypassing the entire game of Pakistan, their Gwadar port and the connecting from the inland of China to Gwadar port and the construction of Gwadar port. So we are bypassing it. So it's a strategic move by India to join this and go ahead with this close relationship, which has with Saudi Arabia. Prince Salman just visited the UAE. We have such close relations. We have what you call our kind of a free trade agreement. We have reached $85 billion of trade. The aim is to reach 100 billion. So this is an important trading partners of India, and also strategically because they also are providing energy security for our country. So I think it's a very important move by India.
Dr. Jawad and Master Kumar, thank you both so much for joining us and sharing that perspective. I'm now going to take you a little bit into history, the history of those ties between India and the Middle East, and why the new route is particularly important, even from a historical point of view. Which of these visuals represents globalization? On the left, you see a scene from hundreds and thousands of years ago. Horses and mules and creaking wooden ships with sails, carrying goods from one place to another over weeks and months, sometimes years. On the right, We see a scene from today. High-tech ships, trucks and planes which can take cargo across countries in a matter of hours. So I ask again, which of these represents globalization? How about both of them? Last week, when the leaders of India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, European Union, France, Germany and Italy and USA all came together to announce that setting up of the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, one phrase which immediately cropped up was a new spice route. And that's an important phrase because the old spice route was actually thousands of years old. So there's a history for this and a precedent for this. Many experts say it was this spice route, the old spice route, which really kick-started globalization in the first place, connecting dozens of regions and cultures over land and over sea. Air didn't exist at that time, obviously. It's also led to the development of infrastructure at ports and along land routes in the entire region. These spice routes were established around 3000 BC, would you believe it, that long back. They linked Japan, Indonesia, India, Middle East, Europe and Africa. The spice routes covered a distance of 15,000 kilometers. India, as the leading spice producer and as the country which was at the center of all of this, was the central point, obviously. Goods like ivory, silk, porcelain, gems and metals were also traded through these routes. This map shows how the spice route connected the east to the west, with the ancient Indian ports playing a key role, being the focus, being the pivot, being the fulcrum of all of this. There was Muziris, a major point in the route, which lay in present-day Kerala. Historians have found that 31 countries in Europe, Asia and the Far East had a spice trade with ancient Kerala, including Afghanistan, Burma, China, but also Denmark, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Malaysia, Mozambique, the Netherlands, Oman, Portugal, Spain. All of these countries were linked with ancient India. Another important port in ancient India was Kamara in what is now Tamil Nadu. Further up, there was Barigaza, what is now called Bharuch, and Barbaricum near present-day Karachi, which of course is in Pakistan. And there was a big tug-of-war between the Arabs and the Europeans to later control this trade because of how valuable it was. So as ancient India and the ancient world moved to the medieval times and towards the modern times, these linkages, these trade points continued to become important. That entire tussle between the Muslim world and the Europeans, which we saw in the 17th century or the 18th century, was again linked with these trade routes. Now, the launching of the IMEC has, of course, been compared to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which itself has been compared to the historical Silk Road. But remember, many have argued that this Silk Road, the Silk Route that we keep hearing about, was nothing but a pale shadow of the spice route in ancient times. The spice routes were established around 2,000 years before the Silk Road. The Silk Road covered around 6,000 kilometers, much less than the 15,000 kilometers long spice route. The Silk Road was land-based, while the spice route was maritime. The Silk Road linked with China, obviously. The spice route had India at the center of it. And of course, there was a darker side to this entire history. All the fame of these spices and that wealth of the East did start to resonate in the West, and that lucrative trade eventually brought in colonial powers to India. It began with the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama discovering a new route to India by sailing around Africa, mainly to break the control of the Arabs over the spice route. Where was that trade originated? The same sort of connections that we are now talking about. And over the next 200 years, obviously, the Dutch and the English East India companies entered the picture, taking over the Indian Ocean trade. By reviving the ancient spice route, it can be said that India is not just reclaiming its spot as the central point of global trade, but also shedding yet another colonial shroud. Now, I began by talking about globalization across the world. And across the world, a debate has been raging for some time. Is the era of globalization over? Are countries and leaders turning insular, closing themselves off, rather than strengthening their links to other countries? If this is true, and it has been happening, then potentially this decision to launch the IMEC could not have come at a better time. Like thousands of years ago, India might once again help to connect the world, ushering in potentially a new era of globalization. And that would actually make perfect sense, because that matches the mantra that India was talking about so much at the G20, Vasudev Kutumbakam. Well, as you can tell, talking about those ancient maritime connections is a particular obsession of mine. So it's a great pleasure now to welcome onto the program somebody else who's been talking about it very, very extensively, somebody else for whom it is an obsession. Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and also the author of the book Ocean of Churn, somebody who's been studying all of those relations, working actually on a ship also to sail from Kalinga to Indonesia if all goes well. Sanjeev Sanyal, thank you so much for joining us. You know, I've been talking about the fact that this corridor is very exciting, India being linked to the Middle East, linked to Saudi Arabia, but this is only returning to a historical truth. This was a historical connection that existed for centuries between India and the Middle East and other countries on the old spice route. You've written about it, you've spoken so much about it. Tell us about the history of all of this.
Absolutely. You know, people talk a lot about the Silk Route through Central Asia. But in fact, Central Asia, the Silk Route was a minor route, which was only traversable once in a while when, say, people like the Mongols united it in the 13th century. But for most of the time, the real trade routes were maritime. And this goes back all the way to Harappan time. So when you look at a map and look at Dholavira, for example, today it looks like it's somewhere inland, but in fact it was a major port in the estuary of the Indus and the Saraswati. And from there, you could sail out towards Oman. This is 4,000, 5,000 years back. People were sailing out along the Makran coast, out to Oman, or out all the way through to Mesopotamia. And from there were trade routes that went even further westward to the Mediterranean, and in fact went all the way even to Egypt. So there is a Egyptian pharaoh from 4,000 years ago, and when they opened up his mummy, they discovered peppercorns up his nostrils. And now the question is, how did it get there? Because black pepper is an Indian plant. So the only way it would get there is that it made its way from Kerala, where it's native, went all the way to Gujarat, to the port, Harappan ports there, went then to Mesopotamia, or perhaps up the Red Sea, we don't know for sure, and then ended up in Egypt, where it was stuffed up the nostril of a Egyptian pharaoh's mummy.
You know, it's interesting that as we look at history and we discussed this in the past, India sort of had a bit of a land fixation, you know, Khyber Pass or XYZ, the land bounders. It's only now that we are really starting to talk or rediscover the fact that India actually had a very rich maritime history. Cholas in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, Kerala and the Malabar coast and its ties with with countries to the west, with Africa and with the Middle East. These maritime connections are something that we now seem to be rebuilding on. We're rebuilding on old historical legacies that have almost been forgotten.
Absolutely. In fact, notice that India is the only country in the world which has an ocean named after it. So it shouldn't be that surprising that, we are surrounded by the ocean. And from very early periods, we were trading in both directions. By the way, the East Coast was trading with Southeast Asia and all the way through to Korea and so on. In fact, Korean history, by the way, starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. So it's both eastward and westward. On the west coast, we were trading with the Arabs, with the Iranians, all the way through to Mesopotamia, through the Persian Gulf, and also up the Red Sea. And so if you were on the west coast of India in the 2nd, 3rd century of AD, and the Roman Empire is at its height, how do you think trade happened? They would use the monsoon winds to go across to Socotra, which is a small island off the coast of Yemen, and then go through to the Red Sea, sail up the coast to a bunch of these small ports, either on the Egyptian coast, in which case you would basically cross from the coast to the Nile by camel, and then sail up the Nile to Alexandria. So that was one route. Or the alternative route was that you went up to Aqaba, and which is, again, near the Sinai on the Jordanian-Israeli side. And then you would go past Petra. I'm sure you've heard of the great archaeological site of Petra. The reason it was important is because the Nabateans basically controlled the route. So you reached up to Aqaba by boat, you unloaded it onto camels, and then you made your way through what is now Jordan and Israel to the ports of what is the Mediterranean, basically either Israel or Lebanon. And from there, again, you sailed out further to Greece or to Italy and so on.
So if you had to recreate that, spice route in the modern time and in a high-tech time, how would it actually work? You would have ships going from Mumbai or from Gujarat to Oman or to the UAE or perhaps to ports in Egypt, and from there they would have to be taken in some way to Europe, which is the tricky part. There's Israel, and there's a port of Haifa out there from where you could perhaps go either to Italy or to Greece. I mean, I know the port in Piraeus has got some Chinese influence there, so I'm not so sure about that. But we can look at where it finally goes. How would you recreate this in modern times?
Yes, and by the way, there are multiple ways of doing it. I know the media maps look as if there is only one way to think about it. But in fact, these things can connect through in very multiple ways. So, for example, you could still go up the Red Sea to Aqaba and out through Jordan to Haifa and other places. You can still go further up to Basra or to Kuwait, and you can connect through from there as well. You, of course, have this one that is being done, the one that is mostly being illustrated is being done through the UAE, through a train line through Saudi Arabia. And so there are many ways of cutting this, depending on where you're trading from. It could connect through to different things on the other side. And by the way, once this network is there, you can even connect through to Africa and do all kinds of things.
One of the reasons why perhaps Indians have forgotten about a lot of this history is because the subsequent history after that particular period wasn't always pleasant. It was the search for India, it was the search for that spice route that really brought the colonial powers out here, like the Portuguese, and then, of course, the British who came here searching for the source of all those wonderful things and those spices. Maybe that's the reason we've preferred to forget about that. But I guess the balance of power has changed now, so we need to rediscover history a bit more.
Yes, so it wasn't pleasant for multiple reasons. Not the least is that first the Portuguese, but then succession of European powers, the Dutch, many people forget the Dutch, the French, and of course the British came to control the high seas. And, Indians initially, in fact, began to develop these caste rules that crossing the seas itself was a bad thing. But even when they did cross it, they crossed it in ways that were not always pleasant. For example, as indentured labor going to places like Mauritius or Fiji or something like that. So even when you did cross the sea, it was almost as if you were going there as a quasi-slave. So the association was that the ocean was somebody else's, in somebody else's control, and you were basically, if you crossed it, it was basically some sort of a slavery. So that was the association. Now, but that was a particular point in time where there's no reason why we should forget our very glorious maritime past, which extends over thousands of years.
And if you look at the period immediately after that, which is also relevant to the entire reaching out to the Middle East, there was an entire period where, in a sense, the Middle East and the Arabs and the elephant throne in Muscat, they were working with the Mughals, working with India, in a sense, to try and control this part of the ocean and keep the Europeans out. So there was a particular historical association even in that entire middle period, if you like.
So it wasn't just the Europeans. So the very interesting thing about this history is that by the time from about the 13th century, where India's own maritime prowess began to go into decline, it wasn't the Europeans that turned up to start with. It was actually the Arabs, and interestingly, the Chinese and the Indonesians who became the powers in the Indian Ocean. So there was a brief period when, in fact, in the early 1400s, when the Chinese came into the Indian Ocean, bashed everybody up, and in fact tried to do many things, including change, and this is interesting given current context, they tried to impose their own king on Sri Lanka, for example. And they then went to Indonesia and tried to kind of push back the Majapahit Empire, which was a Hindu empire in Indonesia, and so on. So the Chinese were very much involved in the early 1400s. And then because of their own internal politics between the Mandarins and the eunuchs, they kind of withdrew. And that was the vacuum that was left behind as a result of the sudden Chinese withdrawal from the Indian Ocean, was the period in which suddenly the Europeans turned up.
Well, it's really been fascinating taking a look at the history of all of this, and it's particularly important because these new relations, these new connections, these new alliances that we are now seeing apparently being developed around here, they've got legs because they are based in historic fact, they're based in history, they're based in centuries of association, and therefore the logic of this exercise still works.
Well, I mean, the history is there because of the geography. And the geography has not changed. So you have to see, if you just happen to look at a map, you can see the west coast of India is right next to Arabia and Iran. And in fact, much of our historical narrative, by the way, because of this way of thinking about it from a northern European kind of way, has got all messed up. But if you just look at a map, you can see it's pretty obvious that people living in Gujarat would be trading with people in Oman and Bahrain and so on. And that's exactly what they did. And they went back and forth and they were trading in all kinds of things. So, for example, even the Arabs, when they had ships, remember, they don't have wood. So the Arab dhow was even at the height of Arab power, built by Indians, because that's where the wood happens to be. It was built from wood from the Western Ghats. And they were sailing back and forth. And similarly, they were not just doing it at the Persian Gulf, but also up the Red Sea. I keep coming back to the Red Sea because the Red Sea is a very important part of this story, because I mentioned about the early period, Roman period and Alexandria and so on. By the period that you are talking about, they were trading through with the Venetians on the other side. So interestingly, the Venetians and the Turks were, of course, rivals. But both their economic machines were based on this trade going through from India through the Arabs and to the Turks and then to the Venetians.
But, you know, interestingly, even if you look at those associations till well after Indian independence, a number of countries in the Middle East and around the Gulf were actually almost using the Indian rupee as legal tender, whether it is, Oman or many other countries that were using the rupee.
Not almost. They were using it because this was their currency. In fact, they didn't have central banks. So countries like Oman, Bahrain, UAE, I think even Kuwait, all of them were using the Indian rupee as their currency for a simple reason. They didn't have a central bank. They were using currencies issued by the Reserve Bank of India. And in fact, the Indian rupee had been used from ancient times. And the rupee, by the way, means literally, the rupiah is literally a silver coin. So the Indian silver coin was the currency in the Indian Ocean region, which is why even Indonesia uses rupiah. This is the main currency that was used. Even if the silver came from, Latin America, it came to India, got stamped by an Indian empire, say the Vijayanagar or the Mughals or whoever it was. And then that coin was the legal tender. So the British then inherited this. And then independent India inherited that further. So it was in the 1960s, interestingly, it was India that began to, from our side, began to discourage others from using our currency.
Well, Sanjeev, thank you so much for talking to us. I think that's a separate subject. We should talk about capital account convertibility and how India can make the rupee into legal tender again. And also, I must talk to you about that fascinating ship that you're working on. Might be sailing all the way from Kalinga to Indonesia at some point. But thank you so much for joining us on this program. Thanks a lot. So a lot to look forward to in all of this, not just for geopolitical and for economic reasons, but also for historical reasons. But a couple of things to worry about as well. And I'm going to bring up that map again. Very important in all of this is one of India's neighbors, the Maldives. Area of concern? Maldives went to the polls on the 9th of September amid China's attempts to continue to exert influence on the entire Indian Ocean and specifically on the Indian Ocean archipelago. Now, all has been well, frankly, in the Maldives when it comes to India for a period of time, and that's why these elections were particularly important. Two of the main contenders were the incumbent, President Ibrahim Mohammed Solih, been seen as being quite close to India, and then the mayor of the capital city, Malé Mohammed Muizzu. Solih is seen as somebody who leans towards India, who's had a very positive relationship over the last few years. Muizzu is said to be from a pro-China party, and he campaigned with a strong message of India out. Now, the first round of voting did not result in a victor, paving the way for a runoff. Now, no candidate has crossed the 50% winning mark, but the Chinese sympathizer Muizzu has taken the lead with 46% of the vote, and the incumbent, President Solih, follows with 39%. Now, both New Delhi and Beijing are going to be keeping a close eye on the next round, because obviously all of these plans that I've been talking about for such a long period of time on this show will, if not, they won't be jeopardized, but there will be certainly a question mark around some aspects of it if the results in Maldives don't go entirely correctly. Now, we do have both sides saying that they will continue to have good relations with India and they will want to keep that going forward. But frankly, I think it would be good if the peace of the last 2 or 3 years is maintained and not the ups and downs and the turmoils of before. But hey, Maldives is a democracy, and it's a democratic election process taking out their place out there. So we're all going to be sitting back and watching the results of that election and the second round of polling, which is going to be taking place very, very shortly, with a great deal of interest. And let's now turn to our regular section as we wrap this program, taking a look at what the international press has been saying about India. And clearly, there was a lot of talk about G20, obviously. So I'm just going to give you one example. Washington Post reporting that the G20 summit, despite the ongoing Ukraine war, was quite successful. It pointed out that it notably omitted any mention of Russia in the declaration, and the Washington Post saying that this signifies a possible shift in global priorities, redirecting focus from Europe to emerging nations like India. It further said that developing countries wielded more influence during the G20 summit, underscoring their growing impact in international forums. But it did ask what the success of the G20 and the final declaration means for the India-Russia relationship and for the question of Ukraine. Al Jazeera in this week's article has touched upon some of these key questions as well, arising from the evolving dynamics of India-Russian relations. It says, historically, India and Russia have maintained a close Cold War era partnership in defense and diplomacy. Of course, at that time, Russia was called the Soviet Union. But it did say that recent shifts are becoming evident, and India has diversified, for example, its defense acquisitions by turning to the US, to France, and to Israel, while continuing to build up its own indigenous industry. Al Jazeera does say that India is unlikely to sever ties with Russia entirely, but possibly the friendship is on a declining trajectory as India aligns more with the West. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Narendra Modi leading an ambitious effort to establish India as a major semiconductor manufacturing hub, attracting significant investments, was a major feature in the New York Times. It says that while India excels in chip design, it currently lacks the necessary infrastructure and expertise for chip fabrication. But to bridge this gap, the New York Times says that India is recruiting foreign specialists and investing in infrastructure, aiming to reduce reliance on China and to secure a more trusted supply chain role. And last but by no means the least, something that is making headlines in India and abroad. Superstar Shah Rukh Khan's latest release, Jawan, which has created a stir in Hollywood as well. According to the New York Times, SRK's previous film Pathaan made nearly $130 million, surpassing even some Hollywood superhits such as No Hard Feelings and Air. As per New York Times, SRK's latest film has made a whopping $52 million internationally within just a few days of its release. But hey, we don't need the NYT to tell us that. Jawan clearly looking poised to be an all-time fantastic blockbuster. Clearly SRK all the way, and not just Hollywood. Shah Rukh's latest film is on a rampage in India as it enters the second weekend of release. Director Atlee's first Bollywood venture has not only pulled up the Hindi film industry from a deep slumber, starting to be woken up with Pathaan, but now this, every day at the box office, the movie seems to be making new waves and new records. So I'm going to end this show by just showing you some glimpses of what has been Jawan fever all across the country and the world.
Once is a comeback, twice is a statement, and the Badshah of Bollywood has made a statement that is reverberating across the globe. At 57, King Khan is still as Jawan as ever and continues to make women go weak in the knees and the fans go crazy. After a 4-year hiatus, Khan has bounced back, not only to reclaim his throne as Badshah of Bollywood with Pathaan, but by beating his own record in a matter of months with Jawan. Atlee's Bollywood directorial debut opened last Thursday and triggered a tsunami at the box office, netting at 75 crores on day one. This was the biggest single-day haul and the biggest opening in the history of Hindi movies. Jawan outdid itself a few days later, when it made 80 crores last Sunday. SRK's January release, Pathaan, is still the biggest Hindi movie of all time in India, with a net total of rupees 543 crores. But Jawan is expected to break this record soon.
And that's a special episode of the India Story where we've really focused on the historical aspects of some of those linkages with the Middle East and how it's always been part of the India Story, seems to be part of the India Story right now, and hopefully will continue to be an important part of the India Story. That's it this week. We'll be back again next week with some of the big news stories out of India and top experts to talk about them.
The stress of our world can take a toll on
It's easy to tell you a flat story. It's easy to show you what's happening around the world. We do the difficult part.
This weapon has been banned, but the US, Ukraine and Russia do not find the bombs problematic.
We also tell you why what's happening.
New drug is making a difference in the fight against Alzheimer's. This medicine helps slow down a patient's cognitive decline.
We look beyond the text. We give you context.
Is China preparing for a war in the Himalayas? And tonight, we come to you with some proof.
Hypocrisy is stunning.
Do leaders mean what they say? Do they ever say what they mean? To find out how real news affects you, your decisions,
Just when Iran took one step in the right direction, its moral police is planning to drag it further back. And once again, the victim will be women.
watch Gravitas.
Welcome and thanks for tuning in.
We don't impose our views.
Did India threaten to ban Twitter? Either that or Jack Dorsey is lying to you.
That is Gravitas. We let life breathe through our show. Gravitas, the informed show for an intelligent audience.
Hello, welcome to This World. Vladimir Amelyan joins us from Kiev, and he is currently on the front line fighting Russian troops.
We believe that the world should be ruled by democracies.
I was interviewing you on television a couple of weeks back.
That's right.
And you said, if you really want to understand Jerusalem, why don't you come here and see it?
And you came.
Here I am. Mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting. Why this cannot be fixed?
There are 425 million guns in the United States, which is more than the population.
The problem here is Trump has been able to make the argument that this is a political prosecution and that he's being singled out unfairly.
Defend our nation. You are saying we could have a cure for cancer.
We'll have treatments for many cancers in this decade. And they're going to come from India.
Downside is that it could potentially wipe us out. But let's start with the upside first.
The upsides are absolutely enormous. The potential uses of this are almost unlimited.
I only discovered AutoGPTs about a week ago and started writing about them. And after I started writing about them, Jeff Bezos followed me on Twitter, and all kinds of crazy amounts of people have been contacting us.
The show where we get you the week's biggest stories from around this world. What is the India story? It's the story of the world's biggest democracy.
We are developing the road infrastructure. In the end of 24, it will be equivalent to the road infrastructure of USA.
We have now entered the growth phase. And I believe that the growth rate in